It's the boy Blackbeard Mirage. I'm back. What's happening? Salute. Just want to welcome all the ladies and gentlemen. You tuned in live for another classic. And we're going to go into some more American history. We're going to also tie American history with some international history. So we're going to look at history of, the ancient American empire, how it was tied to other empires, and how, you can have fights within certain kingdoms. And you could even have certain family fights. And a lot of this leads to a lot of confusion, okay? So we're going to talk about basically the relationship between the indigenous Americans and the indigenous people of Southern Europa and North Africa, okay? Now, the people in Southern Europa and North Africa, in history, most of us know them as Moors, okay? Some of these Moors were Christian. Some of these Moors were Hebrew. Some of these Moors were Muslim or practiced the science of Islam. But nevertheless, in a lot of the historical books, when you all look at literature, you may just see the word Moor, okay? So we're using the word Moor in this tape. We're more so specifically talking about the indigenous copper-colored people of Southern Europe, Central Europe, and North and West Africa, okay? When we talk about the indigenous American, I'm going to just say indigenous American or Aboriginal American. So the copper-colored people of the Americas, all right? Now, although we know that the word Moor, at least when I know I use it, most of the time I'm talking from an ethnic point of view, not religious, not even nation necessarily, but just more so the phenotype of an Aboriginal person of the earth, one of the various copper colored people of the planet when I use the word. But just so we could line it up with some stuff that you all may come across in your studies out there and you won't be confused. When I talk about the Moors now, I'm going to talk about basically the indigenous people behind the Moroccan Empire, Algiers, Tunis, basically the Ottoman, the Osman Ali and the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so we just talking about indigenous people of Europe and so-called Africa. Okay, we talking about those people because some of you all, have come across information that says that that there were colonies in the Americas and that even some of these colonies were ran by so-called Moors, okay, or so-called, black people from Europe and Africa. And this is true. When you look at a lot of the early Spaniards, Dutch, people from Britain, etc., as I've said before in these tapes, some of these colonies that were in the Americas were started by, so-called Europeans, but these Europeans were not Caucasian people. They weren't even amalgamated mulatto people. They was actually, so-called black people or indigenous people. So we talking about the indigenous or the original Dutch, the original so-called French or Franciscan, the original German, the original Briton, the original Celt. What I'm talking about is basically indigenous original Europeans. But, phenotypically and in appearance, we would say that they were so-called black people. So although these colonies in the Americas were started by Europeans at first, these Europeans were so-called black people or copper-colored indigenous people or so-called Moors, okay? So this is the case and this is the scenario. And now these Moors that we're talking about or these copper-colored people of Europe and Africa, they had an entirely different way of life than the indigenous Americans, okay? When you think about these Moors from Europa, you're going to think about basically a lot of industrial, built up cities. They were living more of a more modernized industrial way of life. And when I say industrial, I mean basically using natural resources to build up a lot of buildings, erect up a lot of buildings, and have these little cities and these little metropolis type areas. Now, we've always had that throughout the Earth civilization and Earth time. But just more so picture in your mind the indigenous Americas where, let's say, may have a lot of mounds, some pyramid complexes, etc. But you still see a lot of forestry, a lot of nature, and basically the people living in a more relaxed way of life. It's not a city life. It's not fast like that. And then let's say picture Europa or North Africa, Southern Europe. And once again, you have a little more city type life, more buildings, and maybe even the people live a little closer together. So let's look at it like this. Quite often you will have people that live in the north, let's say in New York. They will say New York is a fast-paced city. And they say that it's a lot of people that live close together in New York in the cities, okay? But when they move down south, they would say that down here in the south, it's a little bit slower. And the people are a little more spread out because, you know, something down here, you know, may take you 30 minutes to get somewhere that may be in the so-called city if you're in a certain part of town, whereas in New York, it may only take you 5 minutes. So you have some people from up north, they'll be like, man, you know, the life down here in the South is a little bit slower. So that's how it was even in the ancient world or in the old world. The indigenous Americas was more like it was like the South, you know. It was a slower way of life. It wasn't so much built up, you know, buildings and all that type of stuff. You know, you had a lot of natural monuments that were built up, and there was a whole lot more space, and there was a lot more forestry and things like that. You know, and the people were living a more calm, slower way of life. They weren't really rushing for anything. They were just living an indigenous way of life, you know, connecting with the land, that kind of thing. But whereas when you think about, you know, old Europa or old North Africa, now I want you to think about New York, something a lot more fast paced, a lot more things going on. You know, think about the ports of the Mediterranean Sea. You got all these ships coming in and out, you know, all these trades going on. Think about in Italy, you know, got these ships coming in through the little rivers and stuff, trading and stuff on these ports, a bunch of people walking around everywhere, you know. So it was two different type of cultures. So although the indigenous people, you know, of the Americas were, let's say, more like a cousins to the indigenous people of Europe and Africa, but nevertheless, we had two different ways of life. You know, over here it was a little slowed down, a little more Garden of Eden like, wasn't as industrial. Whereas over in Europe and in Africa, it was a little faster, probably like you would picture in New York, them trying to build up more, etc. And they were doing a lot and getting themselves involved in a lot more. And also what they were doing is depleting a lot of the land, because if you're building up a lot of buildings and you creating a lot of these city type little areas like they did in Europe, you know, although they were beautiful, but nevertheless, they cut down a lot of stuff to do that. You know, you use up a lot of natural resource to do that. So they're depleting the land and using up a lot of their own natural resource to basically create this certain kind of civilization that they want. Now, keep that in mind, because that's going to, you know, tie into some of these indigenous Europeans and Africans that we call them Moors, how depleting up a lot of their own resources start to get them to look into different ways to make money. And one of these different ways of making money was capturing slaves. Now, at this point in history, these slaves that we're talking about are what you all know of as Caucasian Christians, okay? So these are basically so-called white people, W-I-G-H-T, you know, so-called white people. And what these indigenous Europeans and Africans were doing, more so in particular the ones under the Ottoman Empire, they were what you all know of as, you know, corsairs, okay? And what they would do is they was going into a lot of those little islands around southern Europe, going into these different areas around the Mediterranean. And these, you know, these Muslims or these Moors, these indigenous people, they would go in there, basically kill up a lot of the older men, kill up a lot of the people in the, you know, the little Christian community, because a lot of these Caucasian people were hurt, or they was, you know, nomads. So they would kill up a lot of the old people and stuff like that. And then they would take the women and, you know, children and people like that, and then sell them off into slavery. So you have something that's known as the Barbary Coast slavery, or slavery in the Barbary states. Whereas through a time period of, you know, I mean, they was doing it for a while, but it was about 1.5 million European Christians that were being sold all around the world. Okay. So imagine these Moors, you know, in so-called Europe, selling these Caucasian Christian men, women, and children all around the world now. So they selling some of them to the Americas. They selling some of them to Far East Asia. They selling some of them to different areas in Africa. They're selling them to different areas in the so-called Middle East. Okay. So now you having these Caucasian people being, you know, basically exported to these other areas. All right. Now keep that in mind, because I'm also going to show you how a lot of these activities that these international Moors had across seas, you know, started messing up our way of life here. Because when you start, you know, depleting your own resources, and you start, you know, getting yourself involved in a lot of fuckery, then you're going to start looking for other places to get help from. And then you could possibly now cause problems with these people, you know, and mess their way of life up, which is kind of what happened here. So you got these, you know, Christian slaves being traded all around the world. This is what's going on. And at the time, you know, you had colonies, once again, still here in the Americas. So some of these slaves are being traded, and they're coming even here in the Americas, and they're working on these farms that are owned by some of these same, European Moors that have farms here in the Americas. Now, this is another thing that I got to talk about. The indigenous empire of America is connected to the indigenous Holy Roman Empire, and it's also connected to the indigenous Ottoman Empire or Osman Ali Empire. Now, what I mean by that is this. The indigenous empire of America was always trading and always knew about their other melanated families of Europa and so-called Africa, okay? This was thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. So it wasn't like we were all on these continents and we didn't know about each other. And some of these indigenous people, were cool with certain people in certain empires, and then there were certain people in those empires that they were not cool with. So you have indigenous empire, the indigenous American empire, let's say, cool with certain Moors in the Holy Roman Empire. And then you may have had certain Moors in the Holy Roman Empire that we were not cool with. You got the indigenous American Empire. It's certain Moors, let's say, in the Osman Ali or the Ottoman Empire that we cool with. And then there's certain Moors in the Osman Ali Empire that we not cool with. And it would be almost like, let's say, when you read in the Old Testament about the Hebrews, think about how the Hebrews would be in captivity of, let's say, Babylon or Egypt. And think about how, let's say, Ramses had a hard hand towards the Hebrews. But years and years and years before Ramses' rule, you had Joseph, who was made, made a pharaoh, made in a high position right under the pharaoh, and he was a Hebrew. So you had certain pharaohs under the Egyptian Empire that showed love to Hebrews, and you had certain pharaohs in the Egyptian Empire that did not show love to Hebrews. Just like the Hebrews in captivity, let's say in the Persia and Babylon and these different places. It was certain ones that in Persia, Babylon that was rocking with them, and there was certain ones that was not. So we can't just say that, all the Moors in the Moroccan Empire or all the Moors in the Holy Roman Empire was evil because, we don't necessarily know who was ruling it, and whatever wars were going on at that time, that may have just been somebody ruling it that we weren't really rocking with like that. That's how that goes. Like, let's think about the presidency here in America. Let's take so-called black people. A lot of black people probably had a lot of pride, let's say, in America when Barack Obama was the president, right? But now that Donald Trump is the president, they not really necessarily rocking with the system like that no more. So look at how, you have these different people that come into office, but that don't mean that these citizens or the indigenous nationals are going to have the same relationship with whoever's, have the head seat of office. It just don't go like that. So that's how it was. You know what I'm saying? That's how it was. So let's think about, these different Moors and the Aboriginal Americans. So when they were coming here and setting up colonies and stuff along the eastern shores, along South America, the Central Islands, once again, some of these colonies we allowed them to set up because they probably were paying us tribute. Once again, we were trading with them, so there was no issue. They had their colonies set up. They were not trying to infiltrate into our society, and there was no problem. So you had certain colonies by these European Moors that we agreed with. And then you had certain colonies that they set up that we may have not agreed with. We may have been going to war with them over certain land that they were trying to get, and then trying to, put people on the land to work and stuff like that. And we weren't necessarily agreeing with it. So that's what I'm saying. Like every European colony in America, it was started by some copper colored person of European descent, and not all of them were forced. So that means that, they didn't just come over here and just start trying to rule things like you all think. They had already, indigenous Moors had been trading with each other between, the Americas and Africa and Europe. OK, so it wasn't like they just popped out of nowhere and did this. So, did the indigenous Americans go to war with some of these Moors from across seas when they came over here? Of course they did. I would never sit here and be foolish and not say that. I think what was confusing people when I was saying the word Moor and referring to Aboriginal Americans as Moors, they thought that I was saying maybe we were, I guess, maybe, I don't know, a citizen of, I don't know, Morocco or something like that. Once again, I'm not necessarily saying that. Even the whole alignment with Morocco, look at it like this, people. When you got the Treaty of Peace and Friendship in the 1700s, the 1800s, that whole deal, you got to look at this thing. It is between, it's multiple parties involved with this thing. But ultimately, the parties involved represent the Holy Roman Empire. It represents the Ottoman Empire and the American Empire. Now, mind you, at this time, the indigenous Americans look like this woman right here on my thing. So this is how the indigenous American empire looks right here. People that look like this. That's part of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. Once again, so this is the indigenous American empire. Then you have the Holy Roman Empire. But once again, that's still being ran by people of color or copper-colored people. And then you have the Ottoman Empire, and that's being ran by people of color. So when we talk about the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, this is basically probably trying to heal some of the fighting that we were doing with each other. And this is saying that we going to have a peace with each other. So it wasn't really between, you know, so-called black people and so-called white people like we want to think. That's not what it was. So when you all look up the Treaty of Peace and Friendship and you see the United States or you see America making a deal with, let's say, the Ottoman Empire or Great Britain, I'm not talking about the Caucasian slaves of the British Empire. That's not who was making the deal. I'm not talking about the Caucasian slaves that were of the Ottoman Empire. That's not who was making the deal. I'm not talking about the Caucasian slaves of the American Empire. That's not who was making the deal. Now, later on, these people benefited from this deal that was made. But initially, what I'm saying is that there were Aboriginal Americans that were fighting against their cousins that were in the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire, you know. So it was going down. All right. Now, the reason why I had to explain that history is because this is going to show you how these different Caucasian slaves that these, you know, international Moors had on these American colonies. Now, when they started to free people and these Caucasian Christian slaves start getting freed, now they start trying to infiltrate and come into different parts of society. So I will say this. The reason why you have Caucasian people in the West now is because more of that European Moorish way of life. You know, the whole slavery thing, you know, trading people around, the whole harems and all that, and them trading and sending these people over here to work on these plantations, etc. That's what was going on. Also think about this. In the previous tape, I talked about Cristobal Colon when he came to the Americas and how he had to have a Hebrew translator with him. And he was looking to speak with the great Khan. So you got to think, well, why would he need a Hebrew translator? That means probably because somebody in America is speaking Hebrew. So if he's looking for the Emperor of America and he has a Hebrew translator, that means that the Hebrew, the American emperor was a Hebrew. OK. Second thing is it means that. Oh, this is another thing. When you look into why they were coming to the Americas as well, they make you think that the Spanish were just these conquesting people, you know, looking for gold and riches and, you know, just doing whatever they want. They were seeking to get resources because Europe was very, very depleted, as I'm going to go into a little bit in a minute. They were seeking to get resources, but at the same time, they were also looking for certain prisoners of war and looking for certain people who were sold as slaves that were part of the Spanish Empire or part of the whole Southern European kingdoms. OK, so Spain knew that a lot of their citizens and a lot of Caucasian Christians, or rather more so we could say Christians, the Spanish Catholic Church, Isabella and Fernandez and the Pope, they knew that there were a lot of Christian slaves in the Americas. And they knew that these Christian slaves were on the farms of a lot of the indigenous Americans. So not the farms of the Aslan Ali, you know, Moors that got colonies in America, not the farms of even the Holy Roman Empire Moors that have colonies in America, but they were slaves of the indigenous Americans. So that means, once again, the Americans that look like her. It was Americans that looked like this that had Caucasian slaves, you know. And some of these indigenous Americans, you know, they got into this because they were hooking up with their family members across seas who was doing this stuff. So that's why you will come across certain accounts and you will see that, you know, that so-called Native Americans had slaves. This is where that comes from. OK, that's where that comes from. So I just had to go into that because I wanted people to see that, yeah, you know, there was some little issues and strife between indigenous Americans and these Moors from across seas. That's facts. They brought a lot of these pale slaves over here to work on their colonies and farms. And, you know, that's what it was. All right. So let's go into something else. So, like I said, in Europe, it was a fast pace of life. That's the way that those indigenous, Europeans set it up. All right. They had those beautiful big cities. You know what I'm saying? The Holy Roman Empire, all those castles, all those big things that they was creating. Right. So what that did was, like I said, it's starting to deplete land. It's using up a lot of resources. And what happened is Europe started getting overpopulated. Europe started to lose a lot of space because there was too many goddamn people. There was a lot of food that was, lacking. So in other words, Europe was having a real big problem. So when you all hear about a lot of migrations or so-called, Christian people leaving Europe in the like 1700s and 1800s, a lot of them were leaving because of food shortages. A lot of them were leaving because there was no comfortable way of life where they were living. There was no resources there. And then also, too, there were a lot of persecutions going on from the Inquisition and the Catholic Church. You got to remember that if you didn't practice Catholicism, they weren't dealing with you like that. And at the same time, the time period that I'm talking about, this is before white supremacy. Because you got to remember, white supremacy didn't come to eugenics and a lot of anthropology. That a lot of these bleached out Jews, these Jewish anthropologists that created that stuff in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's when white supremacy really started. So if somebody wanted to know when did white supremacy start, that's when it started. It was a guy named Melville Hertzovich, and there was another guy named Frank Boas. I got to look it up. But either way it goes, it was basically a lot of Jews who started that anthropology and that white supremacy ideology of the Negro's cranial structure is this size, so that means he's dumb and all that kind of stuff. But prior to that, that wasn't the case. Caucasian people weren't rocking with each other just because they had pale flesh. They were fighting and killing up each other so long that, it was still going on. So a lot of heretics were, once again, so if you Caucasian, there were certain Caucasian Germans that were seen as heretics and stuff. So these people were just fleeing out of Europe. The Irish, etc. Once again, all these food shortages. So a lot of these people, when they talk about them coming on boats and all that stuff, this is why they were so savage when they came here, because they was hungry as hell and they didn't have nothing to eat. All right. So moving on, what I want to talk about now is the encounter between Cristobal Colon and the indigenous Tainos, Arawaks of Haiti and Dominican Republic. All right. So as I said, when the Catholic Church took over, because the Catholic Church took over from the Moors and Grenada. Okay. And what I'm going to do at the end of this tape is I'm going to read to you all about the Catholic Church taking over Grenada and how that led to the perpetual servitude of the indigenous Americans. So keep this in mind now, just so these people that still want to get, mad about Moors and all this type of stuff, just keep this in your mind and listen to this question I'm going to ask you. If the Moors of Grenada, who were Islamic in culture, why would, when the Moors in Grenada, why wouldn't do this? This is what I'm trying to. This is what I'm gonna get you to think about. Sorry about that. This is what I want you to think. Why, when the Moors in Grenada, why, when they fall, do indigenous people look like this, go into perpetual servitude? Ask yourself that question. If there's no connection between, let's say, Meru, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Osman Ali Empire, why is it when the Moors in Grenada fell, people that look like this started being put into slavery? All right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you all a little bit about the fall of the Moors in Grenada at the end of this tape. But anyway, so what happened is after the Moors in Grenada fell, you had a lot of, European Hebrews and European Muslims, once again, copper-colored people, being forced to convert into Christianity. And a lot of them were in the Inquisition at this time. So one of the things is, that you all know of is it's all of a sudden now they starting to come to the Americas. Cristobal Colon, his voyage is more so like 1492, 1493, 1491, like October. Okay, in October 1492, 1493, this is when they started to come into the, to encounter the indigenous Arawak and Taino, okay? But when they came over here, you got to remember, this is after the Dum Diversas. So what is the Dum Diversas that was issued by the Pope in June 18th of 1452, Blackbeard? What is the Dum Diversas? The Dum Diversas is when the Pope allowed the King of Portugal to basically ramshack and steal, kill, and destroy everything that belonged to the Saracens, okay? So the Saracens, who are the Saracens? We already went through that. I'm not going to go through that again. The Saracens are basically indigenous copper-colored people no matter where they are on the planet, all right? The offsprings of Sarah and Abraham. We talked about that. So now all of a sudden, so you have the Dum Diversas, which was issued by the Pope, because at this time period, you got to remember that the Catholic Church and a lot of these kingdoms, you know, these are separate entities. So the Catholic Church, they kind of doing what they want to do, and then these kingdoms are doing what they want to do. And the Catholic Church and these kingdoms, they work together, but nevertheless, they not really one coalition like that. So at this time, you know, the King of Portugal wanted the Pope to give him the blessing to go into these crusades, because crusades now represent basically these caravans of these Germanic tribes just going into different places and, you know, taking over indigenous cultures. So the King of Portugal wanted to continue to do that, because after those Moors in Grenada failed, he knew that the Moors had connections and ties to other indigenous people on other continents. So they said, we want a piece of that. So the Catholic Church gave him the blessing. And then all of a sudden, the Spanish army is now acting out the Inquisitions, and they are acting out the Dum Diversas. So this is when you're starting to have a lot of Hebrews and a lot of Muslims and a lot of people with other cultures besides Christianity being attacked. And one of these attacks that you know of here in America is what's known as the Salem Witch trials. And I was talking to a brother in the comment section about that. Salute to the brother Hayes. But the Salem Witch trials, which is part of the Inquisition that you all know about in New Netherlands or so-called New York with the Dutch, or basically these European Caucasians up in the Northeast. There's a movie called The Crucible that goes into the Salem Witch trials. And at the beginning of that movie, they have a scene where, long story short, you know, the Caucasian man, he's looking for these women, and he's going through the woods, and he comes across basically a group of, you know, pilgrim Puritan Caucasian girls, but it looks that they are in some kind of voodoo-like ritual. And guess who's leading the ritual? You guessed it. An Aboriginal indigenous woman that looks like this. So they called it, you know, a bunch of witchcraft and voodoo and all this different stuff. And it goes into the whole Salem Witch trials when they were just saying that everybody's a heretic, everybody's worshiping the devil and Satan, etc. But that movie, the Salem Witch trials, gives you, I mean, the movie, The Crucible, gives you a key insight to what I'm saying, because at the beginning of the movie, the woman who was showing them the indigenous cultures was an Aboriginal American woman that looks just like her. So, you know, that was part of the whole Inquisition. Another thing is so let's go back to the Spain. So now you have the Spanish crown, you know, making these voyages to the Americas, okay? And some of the people that they encounter are the Taino and the Arawaks of so-called Haiti and Dominican Republic. Long story short, this dude, Cristobal Colon, who these bastards are worshiping on this holiday, he did nothing but come here and created genocide, rape, slaughter, theft, destruction, chaos, and mayhem. Bloodshed, that's all it was. They didn't come here and try to create no kind of treaties with these people. They didn't come here and try to trade with these people. They didn't come here and try to learn these people's culture and try to work with these people. They didn't do nothing but come here. They looked at the people. They saw that these people basically lived, once again, a slower way of life, because they were coming from over in Europe where things were faster. They were used to that whole industrial way of life, you know, cutting trees down, building up a bunch of stuff. So when they came here and saw the way we were living, you know, it was very, very laid back. It was more of like a Garden of Eden type paradise. Basically, a lot of natural resources everywhere. So the only thing that they see is that, well, we could cut these trees down basically and build up a bunch of stuff. So that's all it was. And then that's all they did. And it was a bunch of slaughter and kill. And then another thing is that they saw that the indigenous people didn't have, quote unquote, modern warfare technology. Now, you got to remember that at this time period, the empires that were the highest civilizations in the Americas was the Incan of Peru and the Aztec Empire. So those were the big civilizations that had all the gold and had all the the stuff that he was looking for, but he didn't come across them at first. They came across the Arawak. So sometimes I wonder, why didn't the indigenous people have modern warfare and modern technology such as guns and swords? Because even in one of the, journals of Christopher Columbus, it said that how they didn't understand the sword and how they even cut themselves just trying to figure out what it was. And there is a book also called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which talks about, the methods that were used for the European Caucasian to colonize the world, which is true. He did use guns, germs, and steel. But guess what he learned guns and steel from? You guessed it, those Aboriginal indigenous Moors of Europe and North Africa. Now, I won't say that they just gave them guns and gave them steel so they could come over here and cut and shoot up indigenous people. That's not what it was. Nor did they sit there in a room and say, hey, Mr. White Man, this is how you use gunpowder. Hey, Mr. White Man, this is how you use a cannon. Hey, Mr. White Man, this is how you do this. This is how you do that. It wasn't really the case. First of all, the Aztecs, they already were using the cannon. And when you look at a lot of the Spanish-American wars in so-called Mexico, they would tell you that a lot of those indigenous people down there, they had cannons. And the cannon is a Moorish creation. Okay, so the cannon is a war tool created by indigenous people. They had cannons in Europa, and of course across the coast of North and Western Africa, and they also had them in so-called Mexico. So there were certain groups here that had a little more advanced technology, and then there were just overall that weren't. I think primarily the reason why is because, like I said, they had a different way of life here. It was just a slower way of life. When they had warfare and stuff, it was just a different type of culture, man. Just a different type of culture. And that may be subconsciously why the so-called black man is very, very serious about having a gun. Because he remembers how it was when he didn't have one. And he remembers what happened when he didn't have one. I mean, this bastard Columbus was bragging that he didn't need but 50 men to take over because they had, it wasn't no kind of real weapons. In every picture they show you of any kind of indigenous American fighting a European, it always show you indigenous Americans with these little axes and bow and arrows and all these fucking pale mankeys with swords and guns and all this shit. And it's just like, I'm sick of that shit. So you niggas out there just get strapped the fuck up. Fuck all that. But anyway, yeah, I just kind of think about that. But yeah, man. But anyway, this Cristobal Colon, they just slaughtered these Tainos and these Arawaks. And they killed nearly damn near 3 million people, probably in the course of damn near 40 to 50 years. So could you imagine the entire Dominican Republic and Haiti just being wiped out completely? Just literally killing everybody. And they even were doing things like making them pay tribute in gold and making them, pay a lot of gold. And Christopher Columbus even was given these ridiculous requirements, just like the Pharaoh did to the Hebrews. Think about how in Exodus 5 and 7, when the Pharaoh required the Hebrews to get their own straw, and if they didn't have enough, he would, cause more problems for them. And I'll read it real quick. So here it is, Exodus 5 and 7. So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmakers over the people and their foremen, saying, you are no longer to give the people straw to make bricks as previously. Let them go gather straw for themselves. But the quota of the bricks they were making previously, you shall impose on them. You are not to reduce any, because they are lazy. Therefore they cry out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. So you had Pharaoh once again, requiring this hard labor of the Hebrews that was ridiculous. And Cristobal Colon did the same. He was requiring them to have gold and all this different stuff. And whenever they didn't have enough of it, he was cutting their hands off and doing all kind of sick, inhumane stuff like that. Letting the dogs eat them up, like I read on y'all on that other tape. So on that other tape, that's the kind of shit he was doing, So I can kind of see, why a lot of people who deal with the Aboriginal American history may be mad at these Moors. Another thing that he did too was he engaged in a child sex trafficking. A lot of these indigenous Americans, he was engaged in child sex trafficking. I remember coming across that in some stuff. So I can see how, people can be mad at these Moors. But you got to remember that, when the word Moor, honestly, it's more of an ethnic term than it is a national term. So if you're thinking that the word Moor means a Muslim or a citizen of the Moroccan Empire, then you are using more of the modern, updated definition of it. But the ancient definition of that word Moor is no different than Ethiopian. It's no different than really a lot of these terms that just basically mean the indigenous person of the earth. So for just a future reference, when you all hear me use the word Moor, I'm talking about indigenous copper-colored people of the earth, you know, that they used to call Ethiopia. So that's why I use it. So what I'm going to do now and wrap it up is I'm going to read to you all about when those Moors fell, so you can kind of get an understanding of why the Spanish church was able to come over here so easily and why they had so much help, because these same Moors that fell, a lot of them were killed off, and a lot of them were forced to convert and help them, you know. So let's see. It says that the neighboring city of Grenada had already been forced to capitulate. In this splendid Moorish town, a revolt had just broken out among the Moslems, but they had been somewhat pacified by Fernandez's promise that all Moors and Jews should enjoy religious freedom and that they might depart without hindrance, which was a goddamn lie, because the Spanish church created the Inquisition. So they were deceiving and lying those Muslims and Jews of Europa. Because remember now, when we talk about these Moors of Grenada, some of them were so-called Muslim, some of them were so-called Jewish or Hebrew. And then it goes on to say that after 7 years of conflict, comparable only with the Trojan War, Grenada fell into power. It says after a 7 years conflict comparable only with the Trojan War, Grenada fell into power of Spain. On Friday, January 2nd, 1492, the Spanish standard first floated from the highest tower of the old Moorish palace, and the two sovereigns ceremoniously entered the conquered Moorish capital. So if you all have seen me use that thumbnail of the Spain entering Grenada, that's what that was. On the same day, Fernandez announced to all the cities of his kingdom that after great conflicts which had cost much noble blood, it had pleased God to allow the Christian armies to vanquish the Moors. Okay. Then it says that the Jews went about in sorrow and with bowed heads, for the conquest of the Moslems also decided their fate. Listen to that. It says that the Jews went about in sorrow and with bowed heads, for the conquest of the Moslems also decided their fate. So it's showing you that there was a strong connection and some type of alliance between the Muslims and the Jews. They was cool. It was the Christians that they had an issue with. And these Christians were these Caucasian people. Because when these Germanic tribes came out of the Ice Age, the primary religion that they chose to adopt was Christianity. And you had a small little Neanderthal group that chose Judaism. But most of them chose Christianity. So that's why when we say Christian, you know, most of the time we thinking Caucasian person. But when we saying Muslims and Jews, we talking about Moors or copper-colored indigenous people. It's just they had a culture of what you all know of as Islam and Judaism. But they look like me and you. So those Muslims and those Jews of Grenada, they look like her, except they had a different culture. So when those Muslims and those Jews lost their power over there, then the Muslims and the Jews here had their power challenged. So the Muslims and the Jews were the ones who were ruling what we know of as the Incan and Peruvian Empire and the Mayan Empire. That's why there's so many connections between Hebrew and the Mayans, Hebrew and the Incans, and Islam and the Mayans, and Islam and the Incans, because there were a lot of mosques that were found here in the Americas. So the old Catholic Church that was ruled by, you know, the Moors or copper-colored people, they were here in South America too. But, you know, when Spain took over, man, they kicked all the Moorish popes out, because there used to be Moorish popes. So the Catholic Church, you know, once used to be ruled by copper-colored people. But through amalgamation, through those harems and all those other slave practices that those, you know, indigenous people had across the Atlantic Ocean, that's what led to the situation we're in today. And when I even looked at a picture of Isabella and Fernandez, Isabella was a Caucasian woman, blonde haired woman, blue eyed woman, brown eyed.